Hello, friends. It's Chapo.
I don't have a lot of takes on Clinton's hair. Yeah, it was Polk. I mean, but really it was Tyler, I mean, this is the sort of the slippage between the sort of his his accidency, his accidental ejaculation, John Tyler, and who really masterminded his White House really masterminded the diplomacy that led to the annexation of Texas in 1843 and 44. Even though they couldn't get the job through Congress, he really laid the groundwork for it. And really, I mean, it was one of these genuine, doing my dissertation convinced me of this. It's a genuine moment where a conspiratorial cabal, not the only one, but one where you can actually sort of be sure through the documents that a conspiratorial cabal of sort of like-minded ideologues took over U.S. foreign policy and commandeered it toward a very consequential object. Now, of course, there was broad support for the annexation of Texas in the country. It wouldn't have been possible if it would have been more difficult if most of the country loathed the idea. But the political class of the Jacksonian era was not keen on annexing Texas. Even Andrew Jackson himself was leery about these kinds of consequences for destabilization that you're talking about the party system, about a war with Mexico. And it's not like Jackson really was afraid of fighting or, had anything but delight at the thought of a war with Mexico in some senses. But he was cautious as president, and even into the 1840s, he was a little bit skeptical. What hypercharged this was this cabal under Tyler, his first Secretary of State, Abel Upshur, his second Secretary of State, none other than John C. Calhoun himself, and the kind of knot of pro-slavery intellectuals around them who were feeding them advice, who were this guy Duff Green, who's going all around the capitals of Europe and into Texas and Mexico. The fear that Great Britain was going to intervene to somehow destabilize slavery in Texas really hypercharges this effort to get Texas into the Union at all costs, regardless of domestic political repercussions. And I think they win over a kind of dominant majority of Southern Democrats for that, including Jackson and consequentially including Polk. And that helps get Polk the nomination. That's why he's nominated in the first place, is to be the Texas guy. The Democrats in 44 in Baltimore fend off the Southerners, basically install this 2/3 rule so that Van Buren, who's overwhelmingly the sort of the wouldn't say the DNC, but it wasn't the DNC, but he was overwhelmingly the kind of political hack favorite to win the nomination, is stalled. Certainly the northern favorite is stalled, can't get over the 2/3 line. Would have been interesting if Bernie had tried to pull a 2/3 rule. I mean, it wouldn't have helped, but anyway, the South blocks Van Buren's nomination, and it falls to the dark horse, Polk, who in office then rapidly proceeds with the annexation project that Tyler has laid out. So Polk, Texas is in the Union effectively within a few weeks of Polk's administration in early 1845. And by that point, U.S.-Mexico relations are really breaking down.
I always feel for Van Buren there. He spent his entire career kissing those fucking people's asses.
He did.
Like, the key to power is just not pissing off Southerners, and it just still wasn't good enough to get the damn nomination passed.
He forged this coalition that became the dominant force in antebellum politics. 20 years ago,
letters to the Richmond Junto and shit, and it just means nothing.
Yeah, it got him nowhere. It's true.
What are you doing? What have you done for us lately, Martin Van Ruin? Get out of here.
Yeah, and his loyalists. I mean, that's obviously the barn burner story 4 years later. But some of the hardcore Van Burenites were so pissed off. I think Silas Wright, who's one of the New Yorkers around him, was offered the vice presidency, turned it down flat out, which I think is actually a pretty rare event in American history, that a direct offer of even Veep is tendered and just rejected without mercy, just out of loyalty to Matty Van. Those guys had spirit anyway. The Albany Regency, yeah.
So Polk in office assures annexation of Texas, and then very shortly after, a intentional campaign of military provocation on the border at the notorious Nueces Strip.
Yeah, classic. Yeah, beautiful country out there.
Yeah.
I don't think it is. I genuinely don't think it is. I cannot read. I reviewed a book on the Civil War in the Rio Grande, and the number of kind of, written by historians in the Rio Grande Valley, I'm sure there's a poetry to the place like there is any other, but just this description of sort of flat, bug infested, both it's both dry and swampy at the same time. No relief to the terrain. It just does feel like one of the most difficult. I mean, and if you look at some of those counties, even today in Texas, like which we've been looking at with the what's his name, the run against that blue dog Democrat down there. I've been looking at those counties. There's some of those counties still in that Nueces Strip where there's like 75 people live in it. It's just uninhabitable outside of the settlements. Anyway, yeah, he sends Zachary Taylor and his army of occupation to just go right up to the maximal border claim that Texas, the independent Republic of Texas, had asserted. Mexico had never recognized Texas's independence, full stop. But that was kind of a bit of a paper thing. In reality, Texas had been around for 10 years. It was fragile, but it had been established. And could Mexico have swallowed some form of the annexation of Texas? That's another interesting counterfactual, because so many different factions in Mexican politics, it was always possible for somebody to oust another faction by saying you're being too soft on the Americans. But it's possible. But the way Polk did it, it was impossible, because they jammed the army right up to the hilt of Texas's very dubious border claim. And then they sent this belligerent diplomat, John Slidell, Louisiana senator, who was totally in it. They named him a minister when he should have just been a commissioner. They did all of the little diplomacy wrong in this way that ignorance shades into, neglect, shades into disregard, shades into outright contempt. And they knew what they were doing. They were hoping, Polk wrote stuff in his diary like, well, perhaps a declaration of war may not be necessary. It's very clear what they were expecting. Mexico couldn't tolerate this. I mean, actually, the president at the time, Herrera, who was, I think, one of the sort of the Federalists, the liberals of the kind of Mexican party in the early 19th century, is divided between centralists who are conservatives and sort of liberals who are federalists, who are more kind of Enlightenment types. The centralists were more, this is very crude, were more kind of, God and not God and king, but church and strong central government rulers. Anyway, so this liberal Herrera wants to make a deal, or at least could imagine making a deal with him, but not the way that Polk conducted these negotiations, not the way he jammed Taylor right up to the hilt of the border. He sent the largest peacetime squadron in U.S. Navy history to date to the Gulf of Mexico. Everything is screaming war. He did a Putin, basically. Honestly, everything is screaming war, war, war. And there really wasn't much Herrera could do. And he ends up getting cooed by a centralist general who marches down to Mexico City and says, all right, Americans, back off. You're an illegal occupation of Mexican land. It's on. And at that point, not only is war inevitable, it's just a question of, timing, like what hour of the day that there'll be this first skirmish in this disputed territory.
And this leads to a number of skirmishes. And in May of 1846, there's a battle in Palo Alto and Reseda de la Palma, which sees the U.S. Rout Mexican forces and lets America know, like, this is something that can be won and must be won. And then on the 11th of May, 1846, the United States officially declares war. But there is Whig dissent, specifically, and more specifically, a young first-term congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln decides to do an epic own by demanding to know the spot where American blood was supposedly spilled that would justify this war, and is almost immediately turfed out of office.
Yeah. He doesn't. He was that was the his Lincoln's first nickname derived from this his antics in Congress during the war. Right. He was known as Spotty Lincoln because he kept demanding the spot resolution. It's a good one. It didn't really stick, but that was Lincoln in the 40s. Old Spotty.
Old Spotty.
Old Spotty. Yeah.
Yeah. No wonder he lost re-election. You can't win with that. He had to go back to the drawing board, get rail splitter, something.
Yeah. Some of the Whigs really got at it. Some of them got feisty. Even some of these conservatives who aren't, who didn't become anti-slavery heroes like Lincoln. I mean, there's this Ohio guy. I just looked this up. Thomas Corwin, who was a relatively conservative Whig, not a not a big deal. But, they got really fired up and outraged at Polk. And he said something like, the Mexicans will welcome American soldiers they will greet you with bloody hands and welcome you to hospitable graves. I mean, it was really like, it was, in that florid 19th century way that's so wonderful. But the truth is, in the early moments of the war, especially after these first winning battles, I mean, this is where, Polk had the Democratic Party behind him, and he had a big chunk of, the politically neutral or just the kind of classic American looky-loos. I mean, in some ways, this is the U.S.'s first foreign war. That's obviously not true. The United States had been extending its power and dominion over all sorts of other peoples from the moment of its inception, including overseas conflicts like in the Barbary Wars and so on. But this is the first. This clearly represents a different kind of a war on a different kind of scale. And the American reaction at home domestically, I mean, it really does fit into all of the the kind of ugly Chapo stereotypes about, they had a Palo Alto. I know you'll like this, Matt, because it feeds into one of the deepest American, the deepest American religion. Actually, it's not Mormonism, although the Mormons were involved. It's they had a Palo Alto right after the battle. They made a Palo Alto root beer. So they were silly. So they had soda was present in this war.
The true American god, soda. The great god soda.
They had to convert it back into corn syrup. Yeah. Although I guess probably root beer was different than, I don't know. But there was a kind of, this was an early, it coincided with the penny press, right? Famously. So you had, and the telegraph. So you had the first war correspondence. You had the first, breathless newspaper coverage of the war.